Hi everyone, my name is Daniel. I'm an associate professor at Santa Ana College, and today's topic, fitness for the ages, is one of my favorite talks to give. Why? Because it cuts through all the noise and it focuses on this evidence-based strategies on how to improve your fitness and your health, no matter what the obstacles or the challenges are that you may be facing. And we all know that fitness is important, but if you asked 10 different people, what does it mean to be fit? Or how do you achieve fitness? You'll get just as many different varied responses. And there's a high chance that you've probably already Googled questions like, how do I decrease body fat? Or how do I build muscle? Or maybe you've gotten a little bit more specific into your searches and you've asked questions like, how do I decrease my cholesterol? More specifically, my LDL cholesterol. And in those searches, you probably have seen so many different articles, even some 30-second social media posts, promising if you follow these top 3 strategies, you will achieve your goals. And that's why things like this get so muddy, because there's so many different opinions coming from so many different strategies and angles that it makes fitness very overwhelming. So my goal is to clear up a lot of that confusion and make achieving fitness as straightforward as possible. To make the purpose of this talk a little bit more formal, the purpose is to provide clear, actionable insight on how to optimize your cardiovascular and your metabolic health, how to reduce the injury risk, and how to enhance your overall well-being through these evidence-based exercise strategies. So by the end of this talk, I want you to feel more confident about what your next steps are. Whether you've been lifting weights for 15 years or you just bought your first pair of running shoes, I want you to leave here with some more practical, actionable steps on how to improve your health and your fitness. Let's begin. I've spent almost a decade working with first responders. This includes dispatchers, firefighters, and police officers, and speaking to thousands of first responders. It's become clear that first responders fall under one of these 3 different categories: early career, mid-career, and then late career. And at each stage, they have its own unique set of challenges that obstruct their path to fitness. But on that same note, as you move from stage to stage, your definition or your approach to fitness changes. And what often happens is we fail to change our approach as we progress through our career. What do I mean by that? Well, let's look at the early career responder. Whether you're a dispatcher or you're a law enforcement officer, when you first start your career, this is year 1 to year 5, maybe year 7, your main goal is to be competent at your job. And you probably weren't married, or if you are, you probably had no kids. So this allows for time for the gym and the job. Long work hours are no problem because you recover quickly. You have the vitality to hit the gym after a 12-hour shift. You have minimal injuries to hold you back. You're probably still doing your exercise routine that you used to do in high school and your college days. But as you progress through your mid-career, life begins to change. You're now maybe 7 to 15 years in. You probably already been promoted or you're eyeing a promotion. And once you take that promotion, your job description, your responsibilities have changed drastically. Maybe you have 1 or 2 minor or even serious injuries, like a torn ACL or herniated disc. And your off-duty life has changed too. You're now going through this family planning stage where you're either getting married or divorced. You have young children that take up a lot of your time and your energy. So those 90 minutes that you used to spend at the gym have dwindled now to 20, 30, maybe 45 minutes. But then you progress through your late career stages. This is year 20 plus on the job. Maybe you've got promoted again and you've taken more of an admin role. This alone drastically changes your physical activity levels because now you're spending a lot more time sitting down. Those 1 or 2 injuries that you had are probably 1 or 2 surgeries now. You probably got that ACL rehabbed and you lost a lot of leg strength. And you fused that herniated disc. Now you have L4 through S1 fused and you have limited flexibility now. You probably can't rotate that as well through your spine. You can't touch your toes either. And this is where the scary part comes in, because you have diseases like cancer, cardiovascular disease, and metabolic disease. So if I take any individual from any of these stages and I ask them what it means to be fit or how do they achieve fitness, their answers are going to look very, very different. The young dispatcher was going to say that fitness is being able to squat 200 pounds. The mid-career law enforcement officer is going to say, I just want to have enough energy to keep up with my kids. And the late career officer is going to say, I just want to keep heart disease away. You see the wide spectrum here. This is why we call the lecture Fitness for the Ages. As you age, how do you remain fit despite the obstacle and challenges you have? When we talk about challenges to fitness, we have to zoom in and take it one step closer. And I've broken down this approach to challenges for the law enforcement officer and challenges for the dispatcher. So when we put these two in a Venn diagram, the items that have in common are very similar. They may look different, but the way they impact and influence the individual, they influence them in similar ways. Now, for this first one, the officers, this study that was published in 2014, it did a great job surveying hundreds of police officers to identify these key stressors in their life, and they all fell under one of these three different categories: organizational stress, operational stress, and then physical stress. And they all influence one another somehow, some way. Organizational stress, this includes paramilitary structure where there's a chain of command, shift work, meaning long hours, and lack of department support or lack of department resources. And then they have operational stress. This is where officers, they often deal with individuals who are not happy to see them, or they respond to some distressing call like a traffic collision or acts of violence. And those two together, organizational and operational stressors, they put a strain on our psyche. But then you have physical stress. You have a low back pain, depending on whether you wear a utility belt or you wear a vest. They impact the stress you have on your hips or the way that you can maneuver or rotate your spine from side to side. But then the job also impacts you in terms of sleep quality and quantity. And of course, those long work hours, they begin taking a toll. But the same approach now goes for the dispatchers. This study from 2019 that's also surveyed hundreds of dispatchers for their stressors, and in this study they found two common categories: physical and mental stressors. The physical stressors also included shift work, so like sitting down for long hours, or chairs that are not ergonomic, or very little physical activity during work, and perhaps was poor nutrition. But from a mental health perspective, it was exposure to these traumatic calls where you may or may not know if the individual on the other side got the help that they needed. You're in these high pressure environments with minimal downtime between stressful calls. As soon as you hang up with one individual, the phone rings again, and you're repeating that cycle all over again. So again, although the stressors in itself, they appear differently, when you're comparing the dispatcher and the police officer, although they appear differently, they impact our physical and our mental health in very, very similar ways. Both studies highlight this cycle here that perpetuates itself. You guys are first responders who operate on a shift schedule. These are some long work hours, maybe it's 312s or 410s, but during those hours, there's very little physical activity because you're attached to your seat as a dispatcher, or you may have long hours on patrol. But even though that you're seated, there's a constant exposure to stress. You're taking calls from distressed individuals, or you're responding to calls from distressed individuals. This alone gives you a big cortisol spike. Cortisol being that stress hormone. That cortisol spike, it's necessary in order for you to do your job decisively and effectively. But if it lingers, it begins impacting you and your sleep, both from a quality and a quantity perspective. You can't fall asleep for whatever reason, whether you're just amped up from the day or you're ruminating on your workday. Poor sleep also leads to an increase in cortisol. Now, we know that there's this strong inverse relationship between cortisol and a hormone called ghrelin. Ghrelin is a hormone that's secreted from in the stomach, but it's also secreted from the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. Now, ghrelin is often referred to as a hunger hormone. The more ghrelin you have, the hungrier you get. And as you feed, ghrelin is suppressed and you become more satiated. Now, what often happens is that when we're stressed, when we're tired, we subconsciously we look for ways to pacify ourselves, and we often find comfort in food. It's what we call stress eating. After long stressful days at work, we don't crave an apple, we want a beer. We don't crave vegetables, we want something heavy and satiated like a burger or pasta. Now, if we look at the cycle and we zoom out, shift work often reduces your physical activity. Shift work as a first responder is a stressful job, and it elevates your cortisol levels. High cortisol makes you crave more comfort food. So little physical activity, high stress, poor nutrition. These three repeated for weeks, months, years, and your entire career, you can see how it begins impacting your health and your fitness. Now, poor exercise and poor nutrition, it's the perfect recipe to develop a disease often referred to as a silent killer. Symptoms like high blood pressure, high cholesterol, high body fat, they're not painful. You don't know that they're there. And they don't just appear from one day to the next. It's a gradual progression that often goes unrecognized. You don't feel when your blood pressure is elevated. You don't feel when your LDL cholesterol or your poor cholesterol is going up. It's not until you get those readings on, it's not until you get readings on those tests that you recognize that they're outside of a healthy level. Body fat, you can see that one creeping up on a year to year, and that was a little bit more obvious. But this study here, this was done in Iowa, but it's been replicated across many states. This study compared the prevalence rate of cardiovascular disease in police officers in Iowa, and also compared those rates to how prevalent they are in just the general population. It examined over 230 police officers for cardiovascular disease morbidities and whether their employment in law enforcement contributed to the risk of developing said disease. So they examined them all for risk factors associated with these cardiac and these metabolic diseases, and they found that the incidence rate for cardiovascular disease or heart disease is 31%, which is much higher than the general population at 18%. The study found that the three symptoms, or the symptoms that tipped the scales the most, was high cholesterol, high blood pressure, diabetes, meaning a high fasting glucose or a high A1C, tobacco usage, and then age. And if you read that last sentence at the very bottom here of the abstract, it says that law enforcement is associated with an increase in cardiovascular disease morbidity, and this relationship persists after considering several conventional risk factors. Now, I couldn't find a similar study done in dispatchers, but you can speculate that we would find similar results. But this study teaches us that the job in itself, it puts you at a higher risk for cardiac and metabolic diseases because of the items that we discussed earlier in that cycle that we analyzed. So what do? I doubt that any of you will just shrug your shoulders and say, oh well, and accept that heart disease is in your future. Most, if not all of you, are asking the question, well, what can I do to lower my risk? What do I have to eat? How do I have to exercise in order to start mitigating my own personal risk for developing cardiac and metabolic disease? And it's doubtful that any local social media influencer has really explained this issue into this much detail, and much less have an answer. Nevertheless, the answer is not complicated. But before we begin discussing the answers and what we can do, there's one more thing I want to discuss. When we look here at the most common health issues in the first responders, we already know it's cardiovascular and metabolic disease, but it's also injuries. Minor or major injuries. We haven't discussed injuries to this point, but the relationship between these two is very straightforward. When you look at epidemiology studies in first responders, those who have the highest risk of injury are those that have high levels of body fat, those that have a VO2 max or a low VO2 max, which is a measure of your aerobic fitness, and those that have low levels of flexibility. Now, how do these make sense? Well, when you have an individual with high levels of body fat who spends the majority of their time sitting down, the moment that they have to lift something heavy or move in a way that they're not used to moving, their body hasn't been conditioned for that yet. They don't have the movement efficiency, the flexibility, or the strength to do whatever it is that you're asking of your body to do. And that's where injury happens. But We're going to come back to this and discuss it in a bit. I want to focus a little bit more on the left side of this slide. I want to first discuss what contributes to cardiovascular and metabolic disease, because if we know what contributes to the disease, we know exactly what to target when it comes to your fitness. Now, read through this slide, and you see items like age, family history, and personal history. Meaning, if you're a male over the age of 45 or a female over the age of 55, if you have a family history, meaning mom, dad, brother, or sister have already experienced a cardiac event, or a personal history, meaning you yourself have already experienced a cardiac event, then you are at a higher risk for developing cardiovascular disease, or at a higher risk for experiencing a cardiac event in your future. Now, these are non-modifiable. You can't do anything about them. But the rest of this list, these are under your control. If you have your wellness results, that white package that we gave to you guys a few months ago, all these values are outlined for you. So if you have them, follow along. Body composition. If your BMI is over 30, or if your waist circumference is greater than 102 centimeters if you're a man, or greater than 88 centimeters if you're a woman, then you have a higher risk. Hypertension, meaning high blood pressure. If your systolic value is above 140, or if your diastolic value is above 90 millimeters of mercury, then you have a higher risk. High cholesterol, called dyslipidemia. If your LDL, if that value is greater than 130, or if your total cholesterol value is greater than 200, you have a higher risk. If you have high fasting glucose greater than 126, or your A1C, if you know that number, if your A1C is greater than 6.5, one, you have a higher risk of diabetes, but again, you have a higher risk for cardiovascular disease. And if you consume tobacco products, whether you chew it or you inhale it, if you're a consumer of tobacco products, then this does increase your cardiovascular risk and your metabolic disease. However, things that can reduce your risk is, for a cholesterol standpoint, if your good cholesterol, called your HDL, if that number is above 60, then it begins to remove or retract from the amount of cardiovascular risk you have. But now we go back to discussing physical injuries, and we adopt the same approach. If we know what contributes to a physical injury, we know exactly what we can do to begin combating that risk. Now, item 1, aerobic fitness, commonly measured by VO2 max. The unit for VO2 max is milliliters per kilogram per minute. It's how much oxygen you consume per minute per kilogram of body weight. The higher the value is, the more efficient your body is with oxygen. Now, this value is also on your wellness profile. So you open up to page number 2. On the back of page number 2, you can find your VO2 max score. Now, every action that we do, whether it's a specific exercise in the gym or a movement in everyday life, there is a VO2 value assigned to it. Think about it this way. If you climb 2 flights of stairs and at the top you're out of breath, that means that the oxygen cost for climbing those 2 flights exceeded your VO2 value. So it's easier for you to get fatigued. So how fit is fit enough? Well, finding that value is tricky. But if we have to plant our flag somewhere, and if we have to assign a value, we can approach it more from a spectrum perspective. So we know that from a definitive fact that the quality of life begins to degrade drastically when your VO2 max value drops below 20. At this value, it's hard for you to just go for a walk around the block without losing your breath. So we know that the bottom end of that spectrum is 20. And on the higher end, for a general health perspective or a general health and fitness, when we aggregate numerous scientific studies, we can conclude that a VO2 max value somewhere in the mid to high 30s is desirable for basic levels of fitness. And the higher the better, of course. But when we start focusing on muscular strength, this also is a tough one, because we have to ask that same question of how strong is strong enough? How strong should a police officer be? How strong should a dispatcher be? And if you take a moment to reflect on that question, you may be able to come up with an answer and offer a good logical explanation. But the scientific community hasn't agreed on that value. So what we do is we borrow from studies done in contact sports. The scientific community has looked at sports like football, like rugby, like hockey, and they analyze which athletes are getting hurt the least. And what they find is that the stronger their athlete is, the lower the risk of injury. And if they do get hurt, their recovery time is much, much shorter compared to their weaker counterparts. And they measure strength through exercises like a barbell back squat or a barbell deadlift. But if we borrow from this contact sport athletes and apply that same ideology over to now law enforcement officers and dispatch workers, we can conclude something very similar. Weaker individuals will and do get hurt more often. And those pains and injuries, they linger much longer compared to the stronger individuals. So we ask the same question: how strong is strong enough? Well, a great goal to aim for is being able to squat about 3/4 up to 1 times your body weight. And if you can deadlift 1 time up to 1.5 times your body weight. So if you think about this, if you're constantly training to bend over, squat, lunge, crouch with heavier and heavier loads, your body becomes more robust. It builds more resilience against stressors that can potentially hurt you. So as an example, if you weigh 150 pounds, try to slowly, gradually work your way up to squatting 115 up to 150 pounds. And similarly, you do some quick math and you slowly, gradually work up to deadlifting 150 to 225 pounds on a deadlift. Muscular strength equals physical resilience. But we have to bring back this slide. If you don't feel comfortable squatting heavy weights because you're unfamiliar with the movement or just executing with proper form, or if you already have a low back injury and you don't want to deadlift because you'll make it worse, then what do? Well, this is where we have to start modifying their approach. But let's zoom out a little bit and let's start talking now about solutions. This cycle that we talked about earlier and a couple slides ago, it concludes that poor sleep, poor exercise, and poor nutrition is the root of the problem. Now, I'm oversimplifying the solution, but if we can improve our sleep quality and quantity, if we can improve our physical and our nutrition health, then we can reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease and the risk of injuries. So if we want to avoid any pharmacological interventions, then this is the only long-term solution. Now, I want to be clear. I am not against prescription drugs. They are very valuable to improve health in a very quick way. But if I had the choice, I would recommend diet and exercise above all options. Now, this lecture topic is called Fitness for the Ages. We're going to bypass discussing diet. We have another lecture called Nutrition for the Ages where we go into details about the pros and cons about different diets. But in here, we're going to just focus on the fitness approach. Let's begin with some low-hanging fruit. So how do we improve sleep quality and quantity? Now again, we're trying to avoid pharmacology here. So we have to find ways to stabilize your circadian rhythm. As shift workers, you may work days or nights or a swing shift. And depending if it's a work day or not, you have different wake up and bed times. Now I know it's easier said than done, but attempt to have a consistent bedtime and a consistent wake up time. And if you can't standardize both of them, then just standardize one of them, meaning you have a consistent bedtime or you have a consistent wake time. This is one step closer to stabilizing your circadian rhythm. It's off your circadian rhythm that your body knows when to secrete or when to discourage the release of certain hormones. And the more that we can stabilize that, then we can get the body more on this internal clock to really start stabilizing or optimizing your internal health. The second item here is to have some sort of unwinding routine that begins several hours leading up to your bedtime. Now, this is where we're going to have to break a few habits here, like skipping that afternoon coffee or that energy drink, or avoiding alcohol about 4 hours before bedtime, or avoiding screens about 2 hours before bedtime. And if avoiding screens is not possible, then just turn off the blue light or put on that blue light filter on your phone or your tablet. You can either do it manually or now on the modern phones, you can schedule it. So when sunset happens, then the blue light filter automatically goes on. But we're continuing with the list here. Get yourself some sort of blackout curtains or a sleeping mask to avoid any lights that interrupt your sleep quality. And also explore some white noise machines to help facilitate sleep onset. Weighted blankets have shown to improve both sleep quality, to reduce insomnia, and also reduce the symptoms of anxiety. And then lastly, start exploring some breath work. For decades, breath work has been seen as like a pseudoscience. But over the past couple years, we have learned how truly powerful it is to turn off that sympathetic response and trigger more of a parasympathetic response. Meaning it's taking you out of this fight or flight mode and inching you closer to a state of rest and digest. When we shift gears and now talk about cardio exercise recommendations, this is where the internet makes things really muddy. We get overwhelmed by figuring out what is better for heart health, what is better for weight loss. Should I run or should I swim or should I do the Stairmaster? Is CrossFit superior to circuit training? And it becomes this never-ending cycle of confusion. Thankfully, the American College of Sports Medicine has really simplified this as much as possible. The ACSM is this governing body that oversees exercise for overall health and wellness. And they simply state that if you enjoy low-intensity exercise, that's perfectly fine. Exercise at 75% of your estimated max heart rate for a total of 150 minutes per week. Preferably across 3 different days. So if you do some quick math, that's 50 minutes per day, 3 days per week, or 30 minutes per day, 5 days per week. And if you like more high intensity exercise, that's also very effective for improving cardiac health. The ACSM says that you can exercise at 85% of your max heart rate for a total of 75 minutes per week. That's 15 minutes per day for 5 days a week, or 25 minutes per day for 3 days per week. The way you find what your estimated max heart rate is you take 220 minus your age. So if you're 40 years old, 220 minus 40, whatever that value ends up being, you multiply that by 0.75 for low intensity exercise, or you multiply by 0.85 for high intensity exercise. But now you've figured out your spectrum here. Now you know at a minimum what heart rate you should be exercising at, and at not necessarily a maximum, but if you want to pursue more high intensity exercise, then you know what is the minimum heart rate you should be at for vigorous intensity or high intensity exercise, which is at 85%. But this alone, this simplifies all our options. If you enjoy walking, then do that. Just get to your target heart rate. If you enjoy jogging or swimming or CrossFit or circuit training, then do that, but just get to your target heart rate. From a cardiac health perspective, your heart does not discriminate. All it wants is just to be exercised. So if you're following this prescription, you will reduce your risk for cardiovascular disease. Now, if you want to continue improving your VO2 max above that mid-30s, a high 30s value, then the recipe is also simple. Keep your heart rate elevated for as long as you can. Meaning that jog that you're doing, jog a little bit faster and keep that pace for as long as you can. Same thing goes for swimming, cycling, CrossFit, and circuit training. Push your heart rate just a bit higher and sustain that for just a bit longer. The strength training is also simple. The ACSM recommends that we exercise every muscle group a minimum of 2 times per week. Lifting weights helps you from 2 different perspectives. 1, it helps you reduce your risk of injury as we discussed earlier, but 2, it also helps improve your insulin sensitivity, meaning it's drastically reducing your risk of diabetes. Now, the 3 most common ways to resistance train or strength train, which are synonymous, is to lift heavy weights to get stronger, lift light weights to get more endurance, or lift weights to get bigger muscles. This will dictate what rep range you're working in. If you want to get stronger, then you have to lift heavy weights. If you can lift any given weight more than 6 times, more than 6 reps, it's too late. You're not optimizing strength. But the downside to this is that as heavy weights increase, or as the weight increases and you're doing the form incorrectly, this can increase your risk of injury. But on the other hand, If you want more endurance in your muscles, then you have to significantly drop the weight and perform reps that are above the 15 rep range up to about 30 reps. But now if you want to gain size, then you have to lift weights somewhere in between, about 18 to 15 reps. Now, while this is true, it's not all true. We have learned over the past couple of years, according to a lot of studies done in exercise physiology and muscle physiology more specifically, is that you can still gain strength and size through this entire rep range, meaning anywhere from about 5 to 30 reps at a time. Meaning if you're lifting between 5 to 30 reps, you can gain muscle and you can get stronger as long as you're taking that set up to about 1 to 2 reps from failure. Now, don't take it to failure, but take it close to failure. Again, about 1 to 2 reps. So if we bring it back to this slide, if you choose to avoid heavy weights because of pain or injury, that's fine. You don't have to lift the heavy weights. Go much, much lighter, but increase reps to about 30 or up to 30. As long as you can take it about 1 to 2 reps from failure, then you will get stronger over time. You will get more muscle density, more muscle size, and stronger muscles. Altogether, cumulatively, this will reduce your risk of injury. So if you can't squat because of pain or injury, or you're just not comfortable with the form, that's absolutely fine. There are plenty of alternatives. Look at the slide here. Pay attention to the knee angle at the bottom of a squat. This is very similar to the knee angle at the bottom of a lunge. A lunge is simply just a tiny variation of a squat. So if your low back hurts when you put a barbell on your back, then ditch the barbell and start with bodyweight lunges or even some lightweight dumbbells for your lunge. Remember, as long as you take your set to 1 to 2 reps from failure, you can do up to 30 reps and you can still get stronger and still build more muscle over time. The same goes for this deadlift. If your low back hurts during the deadlift, ditch the barbell and pick up some very light dumbbells and start practicing this hip hinging motion with your body weight or some light dumbbells and slowly, gradually build up the weight so this can build some size and strength in that movement. This alone will significantly reduce your risk of injury in your low back. The ACSM, they also help us determine the strength training splits. And they remember that they encourage us to train every major muscle group at least 2 times per week. So if we're only going to be lifting weights 2 times per week, then we train our full body each time. Meaning a full body workout will incorporate some sort of an upper body push exercise, some sort of an upper body pull exercise, and then some sort of a leg exercise. If you're training 3 times per week, then the split will look something like this. Day 1 is upper body, day 2 is lower body, and then day 3 is a full body. Now, if you're training 4 days per week, you can read the slide and see how it breaks down a little bit more. But if you follow the split, you'll be training every major muscle group twice per week. And you start improving your cardiovascular and your metabolic health just by following this template. This will lower your body fat. This will lower your cholesterol and your blood pressure. It will lower your fasting glucose, and overall, it will reduce your risk of injury. Regardless if you're in the early career, the mid-career, or the late career, the template is simple. But if you don't feel confident in creating your own workout program, that's also fine. Because us here at Santa Ana College, we have instructors who have dedicated their profession to helping first responders improving their health and fitness. We have registered dietitians, we have strength and conditioning specialists, and injury prevention specialists that can help you, that we can provide the guidance and education that you need to help begin improving your health and your well-being. If you're interested in that, then reach out to our wellness director. Her email is displayed here on this slide at the bottom. Now, if you've made it this far, I appreciate your time. Thank you.